Someone whispered that a woman had been found unconscious beside a clinic in Los Angeles, clutching her phone like a weapon she never got the chance to use. They said she wasn't dead, just broken in a way no machine could measure. And they wondered what message could destroy a person like that. I didn't know the rumor was about me. Not yet. The truth was far quieter, far smaller. It began on a late February morning in Los Angeles, inside a medical building where the air tasted like routine and resignation. I was simply Marisa Lewis, 70 years old, a widow still learning how to breathe without the man who had steadied her world. I was waiting for my name to be called, flipping aimlessly through my phone, when life cracked open with the precision of a surgeon making the first decisive cut. A notification appeared on the screen, my daughter's name, the child I had raised in a country far from my birthplace, the girl whose first cries I held against my chest, the young woman I believed I understood. I answered without hesitation, unaware that in a few seconds I would become a rumor, a cautionary tale, the embodiment of a warning parents whisper to each other. Even the child you pour your soul into might one day carve your heart out with clean hands and a steady voice. Clara didn't give me time to inhale. Her words came fast, efficient, stripped of the tenderness I once believed she carried deep inside her. She announced her departure to Europe as if she were reading someone else's itinerary. She stated without guilt, without shame, that she had sold my Florida vacation home. She mentioned the old pickup truck my husband Daniel had cherished, the one that still held the scent of motor oil and old leather, and said she'd sold that too. It no longer existed. Just like the life we'd built. She explained everything the way people explain finishing a chore they didn't enjoy. Then she ended the call. I stared at my reflection in the darkened phone screen, expecting anguish. But what I found was the bewildering calm of someone who had just been freed from an illusion. I felt the heaviness of a truth I had been too exhausted to face. The daughter I loved with my whole life had not only walked away from me, she had stepped over me as if I were an obstacle. The waiting room buzzed with low conversations and restless hands flipping through old magazines. To them, I was just another elderly woman waiting for a blood test. They didn't know that a mother had just been discarded like expired paperwork. They didn't know that grief could become a wound large enough to swallow sound itself. And then, out of nowhere, another memory surfaced. It rose with a clarity so sharp it nearly cut me. Daniel. His voice. His final request. 3 days before he died, he had handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in his graceful handwriting. He didn't explain its contents. He simply said I would know when the time was right. I had slipped it into my dresser drawer too, overwhelmed, too numb, too broken to think about anything except how to survive each day after losing him. But in that moment, hearing Clara cut ties with me as if severing a rope she no longer needed, I understood that the time had arrived. Daniel had always known how life would unfold. He had always been quietly prepared for storms long before they appeared. And somehow, through death or intuition or the strange foresight love gives to certain men, he had left me something to anchor myself when the people I trusted most let go. The nurse eventually called my name. I followed her like a shadow, learning how to walk again. The doctor spoke about vitamins and cholesterol and the importance of rest, but his words floated somewhere above me, never landing, never touching anything real. My thoughts were already inside my bedroom, opening that untouched envelope. When I left the clinic, I walked slowly, not because my body was weak, but because my mind had begun rearranging itself in quiet, deliberate ways. I had no car anymore. Clara had taken that from me. So I waited for the bus, surrounded by strangers whose faces blended into the haze of morning rush. I boarded when it arrived, holding on to the rail with the steadiness of someone who refused to fall one more time today. Every shudder of the bus felt like a countdown. By the time I reached my street, I moved like a woman fighting the pull of two worlds, the world of what had been and the world of what needed to begin. Inside my bedroom, the drawer opened with a familiarity that struck something deep inside me. The envelope was right where I had left it, untouched by grief, untouched by time, untouched by betrayal. It waited with the patience only truth possesses. I held it for a long moment before I dared to open it. Daniel's handwriting greeted me first, looping, gentle, steady, the opposite of everything I had lived since he passed. His letter revealed a life he had built in silence, a life he had kept hidden, not out of secrecy but out of protection. He knew his daughter. He knew ambition could erode love if exposed to the wrong people. He knew that money had its own gravitational pull, and not everyone could resist it. He had been a simple bus driver by title, but in reality, he was a quiet architect of possibility. He invested, he purchased properties, he grew wealth in places I never thought to look. He created a company under my name to shield everything from the world, including Clara. And while she believed she was abandoning a helpless mother, she had actually stolen the smallest fragments of an ocean she never knew existed. The letter ended with a line that pressed into my heart with the weight of destiny. You will know when to act, and when that moment comes, you must trust yourself the way I have always trusted you. I held the documents in my trembling hands, realizing that Clara's betrayal had not broken me. It had awakened me. Clara thought she had left me with nothing. She thought she had taken the last pieces of Daniel from me. She thought she had ended something. But she was wrong. She had ignited the beginning. And as I sat there, absorbing the truth Daniel had left behind, I felt something powerful stir inside me. Not anger, not revenge, but a resolve forged from a lifetime of love, loss, resilience, and the quiet strength of a woman underestimated for far too long. I had been a rumor that morning, but by nightfall I would become the woman Daniel always believed I could be. The next morning arrived with a heaviness that felt almost ceremonial, as if life itself had paused for a moment to watch what I would do next. I woke early, long before the sun touched anything, long before the world began asking for pieces of me I no longer had to give. Something in me had shifted. It wasn't confidence, not yet. It was more like recognition, the quiet understanding that a path had already been carved for me, and all I needed to do was step into it. I sat at the edge of my bed, clutching Daniel's envelope against my chest like a talisman. His handwriting, his foresight, his love, everything he left behind was no longer just an inheritance. It was a compass, pointing toward a version of myself I had forgotten existed. I wasn't the fragile widow my daughter believed she could manipulate. I wasn't the helpless, elderly woman people assumed would eventually fade into silence. I was someone who had loved deeply, survived grief, raised a child alone in a foreign country, and held the fragments of a life together long before anyone knew I was breaking. And now, with the truth Daniel left behind, I felt my spine straighten in ways it hadn't in months. Clara's betrayal played in my mind, not as a wound anymore, but as a revelation. It showed me who she had become, yes, but more importantly, it showed me who I was no longer willing to be. Love could make you blind, but betrayal could restore sight with painful clarity. And for the first time in a long time, I saw myself clearly. I made my way to the kitchen, moving slowly, feeling the weight of every memory that lived in that space. This was where Daniel used to hum under his breath while making coffee, where he held my waist from behind, grounding me with quiet affection. Where Clara once sat as a child, swinging her legs, asking questions about stars and dreams and what it meant to be alive. All those pieces felt distant now. Time had changed them, and pain had reshaped them. But grief had taught me something important. Memories don't disappear when people do. They simply become echoes you learn to live with. I boiled water, poured myself tea, and opened the envelope again, this time not as a grieving wife, but as the woman who now carried the responsibility of Daniel's final intentions. The financial documents were precise, organized, almost surgical in their clarity. Daniel had been a quiet strategist, hiding entire worlds beneath the modest salary of a bus driver. Rental properties, investments, a company structured to protect our assets from anyone who might use love as leverage. I traced my fingertip along the signatures, absorbing the reality that my husband had trusted me more than I had trusted myself. He had seen the cracks in Clara long before I allowed myself to acknowledge them. The entitlement, the hunger for validation, the ease with which she allowed temporary luxuries to eclipse the permanent things that mattered. Daniel had always been gentle, but he wasn't naive. He loved Clara fiercely, but he loved truth more. I closed the envelope and exhaled long and controlled. I knew what I had to do next. I took out my old address book, one of the few things Clara hadn't deemed valuable enough to touch, and flipped through its worn pages until I found the name I was searching for. Anthony Carter, our longtime family attorney. He had handled Daniel's will. He had attended the funeral. He had looked at me with the kind of sympathy that comes from knowing more than he is allowed to say. And he had told me to call him if I ever needed anything. I dialed his number with steady hands, not trembling, not afraid, just ready. As the phone rang, I felt something unfurl inside me, something Daniel must have known would grow once I discovered the truth. When Anthony answered, I didn't waste words. I explained that I had found Daniel's envelope. I told him I needed help understanding the full extent of what my husband had left behind. I told him I needed everything handled discreetly. And I told him I needed to regain control of the assets Clara had illegally sold or transferred. Anthony responded with the seriousness of someone who had been waiting for this moment. He knew the legal path. He knew the loopholes. He knew what Clara had done and what she had no right to do. He reassured me that every step could be undone because Clara had never been the legal owner of anything she touched. She had acted with the confidence of someone who assumed her mother had nothing. But the law didn't care about her assumptions. It cared about signatures, ownership, documentation, things Daniel had masterfully prepared. When I hung up, I didn't cry. For the first time in months, I didn't feel small. There was no shaking in my hands, no heaviness on my chest. Instead, a strange stillness settled in me, a stillness that felt like the moment before a curtain rises or a door opens. Something new was beginning. I started making a list, not of people I needed to confront, but of pieces of my life I needed to reclaim. The Florida vacation home Clara sold, the truck Daniel adored, the bank accounts she tried to access, the apartment building she believed belonged to her husband, even the documents she made me sign after Daniel died, sliding them under my pen with soft words and a disguised agenda. That signature wouldn't protect her. Not anymore. As I wrote, I realized something else. This wasn't about revenge. I didn't want to destroy Clara. I didn't want to punish her. I didn't even want to reclaim wealth for the sake of possession. What I wanted, what I needed, was clarity. The kind of clarity Daniel had trusted me to find. I needed to understand why my daughter had become someone who could sever her ties to me with such ease. And I needed to decide on my own terms whether I was willing to let her back into my life once the truth was no longer a secret. Because love doesn't disappear just because it is betrayed. But neither does betrayal disappear just because love wants it to. As the morning stretched into afternoon, I felt the quiet pulse of a strength I didn't know I still had. A strength that came not from anger, but from purpose. A strength born from the realization that I had spent my entire life giving, hoping, believing, and waiting. And now finally I was allowed to receive not gifts, not apologies, but the truth. The envelope had not been simply a message. It had been a mirror. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to look into it without flinching. I rose from my chair, placed the envelope back into the drawer, and felt Daniel's presence settle into the room like a quiet vow. He had trusted me to carry the weight of what he left behind, and now, with every breath, I felt myself stepping into the woman he always believed I could be. The world didn't know it yet. Clara didn't know it yet. Even I didn't fully know it yet. But something irreversible had begun. The days that followed moved with an eerie quietness, as if life were inhaling, slowly preparing itself for a shift it had sensed before I could name it. I began rising early, not out of habit, not out of obligation, but out of instinct. Something inside me had awakened something that recognized momentum, the way a seasoned sailor senses wind long before the waves reveal it. I wasn't rushing toward anything. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply preparing, aligning, gathering the pieces of myself that had been scattered during grief. It felt like rediscovering a soundtrack I had once lived to the rhythm, faint but undeniable, reminding me that a woman's strength doesn't disappear with age. It merely becomes quieter, deeper, harder to break. Anthony, the attorney, kept me updated with the precision of a surgeon, guiding a patient through the stages of recovery. He worked through Daniel's documents, double-checked ownership, traced signatures, and outlined the legal pathways that would restore everything Clara had stolen. Every update felt like a stitch closing an old wound. The Florida vacation home already flagged for fraudulent sale. Daniel's truck, located with paperwork proving Clara had no legal right to transfer ownership. The apartment building, firmly under my company's name with a trail of documents showing years of careful structuring Daniel had put in place. Piece by piece, my life was returning to me, but it wasn't the assets that grounded me, it was the clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to life. I was directing it. And yet beneath all the progress, there was a quiet ache. I could not ignore the absence of Clara. My daughter had always been a complicated constellation of contradictions, brilliant but reckless, affectionate but self-centered, loving but easily blinded by superficial promises. Her journey from childhood to adulthood had not been smooth. She had always wanted more, wanted bigger, wanted something shimmering and grand, something America often dangled in front of immigrants' children like a glittering promise they chase for a lifetime. But I never imagined she would run so fast she would leave me behind. I never imagined she would forget the woman who crossed oceans to give her choices she hadn't earned yet. I thought motherhood granted immunity against certain forms of abandonment. I believed that no matter how sharp the edges of life became, a daughter would never allow them to cut the hands that raised her. But I was wrong, and the realization didn't make me bitter. It made me aware. Love does not prevent betrayal. It only makes it hurt more. Still, something in me held on to the idea that Clara wasn't lost, only drowning, and sometimes drowning people claw at the ones trying to save them. Anthony called one morning, his tone shifting into something more certain, more decisive. He said the legal groundwork was nearly complete. He said every asset was being transferred back under my direct control. He said Clara's unauthorized sales and signatures would be nullified. He said Daniel's plan had been nearly foolproof. My husband had built a fortress around our lives, and Clara had only managed to scratch its surface. But Anthony also said something else, something that lingered like a shadow in my mind Clara didn't know yet. She was somewhere across the ocean, living under the illusion that she had freed herself from the gravity of responsibility, unaware that every decision she made was unraveling behind her. She had created a future built on sand, and Europe was simply the tide waiting to pull it apart. The irony was sharp enough to cut. She believed she was leaving me behind, but she had only managed to leave herself at the mercy of the consequences she created. I spent several evenings alone, sitting in the space Daniel used to occupy, feeling his presence in the decisions he made for me. My husband had known something I didn't. He had seen a version of the future I refused to consider. He understood that love must be protected, but also that dependency must be prevented. He knew our daughter had a vulnerability. I never fully admitted she wanted the world, but she didn't want the weight that came with it. Daniel had protected her from her own potential for destruction, hoping time would change her. But time doesn't change people. Circumstances do. And Clara had engineered her own. As days turned into weeks, something unexpected began growing inside me, an understanding, a perspective I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. Clara's betrayal hadn't destroyed me. It had liberated me from illusions. It had shown me the shape of a future I hadn't known. I was allowed to want a future where I wasn't the supporting character in my daughter's life, but the author of my own. That realization didn't make me cold toward Clara. If anything, it sharpened my compassion. Because I finally saw her clearly, not as the daughter I raised, not as the child I loved, not as the young woman I hoped she'd become, but as a person struggling under the weight of choices she never learned to carry gracefully. Clara had always been dazzled by shortcuts. She mistook recklessness for ambition. She believed financial security could be built on charm connections and luck rather than discipline, patience, and sacrifice. She believed entitlement was inheritance. She believed love was something that would stay even when she neglected it. But she forgot that even oceans evaporate when neglected long enough. One afternoon, I opened Daniel's envelope again, not to review the documents, but to reread his letter. His words flowed into me with the same warmth they carried the first time, but now they felt different, heavier, wiser, almost prophetic. He knew the world would test me. He knew grief would make me vulnerable. He knew Clara might falter in ways I wouldn't be ready to understand. But he also knew I possessed a strength forged from years of survival, adaptation, and resilience. He trusted me long before I learned to trust myself. I closed the letter and held it against my chest. I realized then that Daniel didn't leave me solitude, he left me sovereignty. He entrusted me with the power to navigate the storm, not by shielding me from it, but by giving me the tools to weather it. With every passing day, I grew more certain that Clara would return, not because she missed me, but because life would eventually demand accountability. And when that moment came, she would discover that the woman she thought she abandoned had not been sitting still waiting for an apology. She would find a mother transformed, not bitter, not vengeful, but awake. That awakening deepened when Anthony sent me a final set of documents papers confirming my ownership not just on paper but in full legal authority. For the first time since Daniel's death, I felt the ground beneath me solidify. The uncertainty that once paralyzed me dissolved. The fear that used to follow me into sleep evaporated. I was no longer reacting to life. I was stepping into it. Every piece of my past, grief, betrayal, sacrifice, had been reshaped into a new identity. I was a woman with agency, with clarity, with purpose. I was a woman who had been underestimated by her own daughter, dismissed by strangers, overlooked by a society that saw age as fragility. But age had given me something youth never could: perspective. Perspective sharpens into power when paired with truth. And truth, once revealed, cannot be silenced. I started planning not with anger but with intention. I didn't know exactly what form justice would take, but I knew it wouldn't be loud or cruel. It would be measured, deliberate, precise, like Daniel's investments, like the steps of healing, like the slow rebirth of someone who has finally remembered her own worth. The world hadn't changed. Clara hadn't changed. Daniel was still gone. But I had changed. And that was enough to change everything that came after. The weeks drifted forward with a quiet rhythm, the type that belongs to people who have outlived heartbreak and learned to breathe differently because of it. There were no grand moments, no cinematic revelations, just a steady unfolding of truth, the kind that grows roots before it breaks the surface. Every day, I felt Daniel's presence in the choices I made. Not in the sentimental way widows often speak of their husbands, but in a grounded, practical sense. He had left a blueprint, a map. I didn't know how to read at first, but each passing day my understanding sharpened. I wasn't just following instructions, I was stepping into a role he had quietly prepared me for. Anthony continued to guide me, his updates becoming steady markers in my new routine. He spoke of legal processes that had once intimidated me, asset recovery titles reinstated, fraudulent transfers reversed. In his voice, I heard the calm certainty of someone who understood that I was no longer the fragile woman he met months ago. I was becoming someone else, someone Daniel had trusted, someone Clara would never anticipate. But beneath the legal victories and the administrative progress, There was a deeper shift happening inside me, a reordering of priorities, a reevaluation of truths I had always held sacred. Motherhood had always been my defining identity. I had built my life around it, stitched my days together through Clara's milestones, her struggles, her dreams. I believed motherhood required sacrifice, and I had been willing to offer anything, even pieces of myself, so my daughter could rise higher than I ever could. But sacrifice without boundaries becomes self-erasure, and love without honesty becomes delusion. In the quiet hours of early morning, when the world hadn't yet asked anything of me, I allowed myself to confront the truth I had avoided for years. Clara had been slipping away long before her phone call, long before Europe, long before the lies wrapped in carefully chosen words. She had been drifting toward a version of life where I no longer fit, not because she stopped loving me, but because she loved the illusion of success more. I could see it clearly now, the shift in her eyes during Daniel's last months, the sudden urgency in the paperwork she brought me, her eagerness to control the narrative after the funeral. She had mistaken responsibility for burden. She had interpreted independence as detachment. She believed that power came from ownership rather than understanding. Daniel had seen it earlier, but love had blindsided me. It always does. Still, despite the pain, I found no hatred inside me. Only an ache, a deep, steady ache, that came from realizing that the child you raise and the adult they become are sometimes separated by choices you never saw coming. One afternoon, Anthony sent me a long message detailing the final steps of the legal process. Everything was nearly complete. All that remained were a few signatures from me, a few administrative filings, and then the world would know, not through announcements, not through drama, but through paperwork, the quiet truth that I was the sole owner of every asset Daniel left behind. The irony was sharp. Clara had spent her energy building a new life on top of the rubble of mine, unaware that the foundation she believed she controlled had never truly been hers to touch. She had built her confidence on sand, and Daniel's planning was the tide rising to reclaim it. But I didn't take pleasure in her downfall. I wasn't sculpting revenge. I wasn't plotting punishment. Everything I did from this point forward came from a place deeper than anger, deeper even than justice. It came from a place of clarity. Clara needed to learn, truly learn. And sometimes learning demands falling farther than you imagined you could survive. But before life could teach her, I had to understand something essential. Why had she changed so drastically? Why had she become someone I barely recognized? The answer came to me gradually over several nights of quiet reflection. I began to see Clara not as the woman who betrayed me, but as the child she used to be, the little girl who clung to my hand on the first day of school, terrified and excited. The teenager who begged me to let her attend an expensive summer program because all her American friends were going. The young adult who embraced opportunity with a hunger that sometimes blurred her sense of gratitude. She had always been reaching for something brighter, something bigger, something she believed would validate her existence in a place where immigrants often fight not just for survival but for acknowledgement. In America, success is treated like oxygen, and Clara had inhaled so deeply she forgot where she came from. She forgot who held her when the weight of the world felt unbearable. She forgot who sacrificed so she could chase dreams in a language that used to be foreign. But forgetting is not unforgivable. It is simply human. I began collecting small pieces of myself during this time, memories, habits, moments that made me feel like I was reclaiming my identity. I cooked meals Daniel loved. I repaired a necklace Clara broke when she was 9. I donated clothing I no longer wore. I organized old photographs, letting the faces remind me that life is not a single chapter but a constellation of experiences. Every memory taught me something new about who I was becoming. I wasn't the same woman who answered Clara's call months ago. That version of me was bruised, overwhelmed, still learning how to navigate grief. She was a woman who believed loss was something you endured, not something you learned from. But now I was shifting into a different form, a form molded by truth, fueled by purpose, strengthened by resilience. And with every shift, I felt Daniel closer. Not as a memory, but as a presence woven into the choices I made. One morning as I reviewed documents, Anthony emailed a thought entered my mind gently yet firmly. I would eventually need to see Clara again. Not to confront her, not to scold her, but to face her with the clarity she had tried so hard to ignore. This wasn't about reclaiming assets. It wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't even about justice. It was about courage, the courage to face the person who hurt you and stand firm in your truth, without shrinking, without apologizing for your strength, without fearing their reaction. I knew Clara would return one day. Europe wasn't her escape, it was her lesson. And when the weight of her choices pressed hard enough, she would have no choice but to come back to where everything began. She would look for me, and when she did, she wouldn't find the mother she abandoned. She would find the woman she underestimated. That truth carried me through the next several days. Each step I took, every legal document I signed, every decision I made felt less like reclaiming what was mine and more like preparing for the moment Clara would face the consequences she created. I didn't imagine that moment with bitterness. I imagined it with stillness. She needed to see who I had become. She needed to see that love did not make me small. She needed to see that strength can be gentle, and gentleness can be powerful. She needed to see that her choices did not define me, they only revealed me. And as that understanding settled in my chest like a quiet flame, something inside me solidified. Daniel had not simply left me wealth. He had left me the tools to rebuild not my finances but my sense of self. In becoming the woman he trusted, I realized something profound. I was finally learning to trust myself. The transformation was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was not something the world would applaud. It was internal. It was sacred. It was real. The kind of transformation that prepares a person for the moment everything changes. And that moment, I sensed, was approaching sooner than I thought. The day Clara's world began to collapse arrived without warning, the way storms do when the air has been too still for too long. I felt it before I knew it. There was a weight in the atmosphere, a subtle pull inside my chest, the way a mother senses her child long before a phone rings or a knock arrives. It wasn't fear. It wasn't dread. It was recognition, the unmistakable feeling that consequences were finally catching up to choices made in pride. For weeks, I had lived in a rhythm shaped by truth and purpose. I no longer woke with the heaviness of grief or the tremor of betrayal. Instead, each morning felt like a step deeper into the woman I had rediscovered. I didn't anticipate what was coming. I didn't need to. Life has a way of delivering what must be faced whether we're ready or not. Anthony had been working relentlessly on Daniel's files. His updates had become a part of my days, quiet confirmations that everything was aligning the way Daniel intended. I learned to read legal language, to understand the structure of ownership, to see through the illusions that had once intimidated me. Knowledge, I realized, is not youth's privilege. It is anyone's reward for refusing to remain ignorant. And in those weeks, I grew into myself. I learned to breathe without shrinking. I learned to stand without apologizing. I learned to remember without aching. I learned to look forward without fear. But even in growth, there are truths that hold fast, and one of them is this: a mother never stops loving her child, even when loving her means standing back while she falls. Clara had been silent since the morning she severed herself from me. I didn't know where she slept. I didn't know whether she ate. I didn't know if she was safe. I didn't know if she regretted anything or simply moved forward with the same fierce certainty that blinded her to consequence. But I did know something else. Unseen threads always pull people back toward the places they abandoned, especially when the ground beneath them begins to crack. The first sign came from Anthony. He called me with a tone I had never heard from him before, a tone carrying both concern and inevitability. He explained that the apartment building's bank records had triggered an alert. Evan, my son-in-law, had been using the property as collateral without proper ownership. Clara's signature had appeared on loan documents she legally had no right to authorize. The financial institutions had begun investigating, and every thread led back to a single truth. Clara's life in Europe was built on a foundation that had just been legally shattered. The consequences marched in with quiet precision. The fraudulent loans, the debts Evan accumulated, the false promises he made to Clara, the desperate decisions she believed were necessary, the lies she told herself to justify them, all of it fell onto her at once. I didn't know she was coming home until my neighbor, Mrs. Ramirez, mentioned it. She told me that someone had seen Clara's name on the arrivals list at LAX, that she was alone, carrying almost nothing, looking thinner than before, that she had the air of someone who had run out of places to hide. Mrs. Ramirez spoke with the hushed sympathy neighbors reserve for tragedies that feel personal even when they aren't. But I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't rush into the familiar ache of motherhood. Instead, I felt something unexpected: readiness. Clara's collapse wasn't a punishment. It was a turning point, the kind that life forces upon us when we've ignored too many warnings. I knew she would reach for me eventually. Not because she wanted to, but because she had nowhere else to go. Falling isn't what destroys us. Refusing to face the truth after the fall, that's what breaks people. The next morning drifted in quietly, but I felt an energy beneath the silence, a subtle hum that told me Clara was closer than she had been in months. I went through my routine with steady hands. I brewed tea, reviewed the documents Anthony had sent, wrote a few notes in the margins, and organized the folder Daniel once touched. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I was preparing for clarity. There comes a moment in every parent's life when love must detach from rescue. Not from affection, not from loyalty, not from hope, but from the instinct to protect a child from the consequences they've crafted. It is a painful evolution, but a necessary one. If love shields too much, it becomes a trap. If love allows everything, it becomes permission for harm. And I had decided quietly, firmly, that the love I offered Clara would no longer be the kind that erased her mistakes. It would be the kind that required her to understand them. By midday, the final confirmation came. Anthony informed me that Clara had attempted to access financial records in Europe only to be blocked by the legal reversals he and I had initiated. Her accounts were frozen. Evan had vanished. The money she believed she controlled had evaporated into legal disputes she could not escape. And now she was heading back to the one place she still associated with safety. Back to the home she had discarded. Back to the mother she had considered disposable. The irony did not comfort me. It humbled me. As afternoon deepened, memories began returning, memories I hadn't invited but also didn't push away. Clara's first heartbreak. Her first college rejection. The night she confessed, she felt like she didn't belong among her friends, not American enough for them, not Vietnamese enough for her roots. The guilt she carried when Daniel got sick. The ambition she clung to as proof that she was building a life better than the one I had started with. She wasn't cruel. She was lost. And sometimes the lost hurt the very people who would walk through fire to find them. Evening approached, with the quiet certainty of a story entering its next chapter. I sat at the dining table, my hands resting on the envelope. Daniel left feeling the weight of every decision he had made on my behalf. He had trusted me with truth. He had trusted me with legacy. He had trusted me with our daughter's future, even when she didn't deserve the safety he created. In those moments holding his envelope, I understood something profound. This journey was never about money. It was about identity. It was about remembrance. It was about seeing the woman Daniel saw, a woman worthy of respect, of agency, of a life not defined by sacrifice. And now that woman was about to face a daughter who thought she knew everything. After years of being the caregiver, the protector, the giver, I sat in silence preparing to meet Clara, not as someone she could manipulate, but as someone she would finally have to recognize. Not an obstacle, not a burden, not a relic of the past, but a force, quiet, older, wiser, and unshakable. I felt no fear, no hesitation, no trembling breath. Just a profound steadiness, the kind that grows only after surviving grief, betrayal, and rebirth. And beneath that steadiness was a truth I could not ignore. Clara's return would not heal everything, but it would begin something new, something necessary, something honest, something Daniel had foreseen long before either of us. The fall was hers, the clarity was mine, but the reckoning belonged to both of us. When night finally settled in, I sat alone at the table, hands folded, heart anchored, mind clear. I didn't know what shape Clara's collapse had taken. I didn't know how deeply she had been hurt or how much she had lost. But I knew this. She was coming home, and I was ready to meet her not as the mother she remembered, but as the woman she had forgotten existed. Clara returned to the United States the way people return from disasters, quietly, invisibly, as if the world might collapse further if they made too much noise. I did not see her arrival, but I felt it long before anyone confirmed it. A mother knows when her child has been beaten by life in ways love could never prevent. I woke that morning with a strange heaviness, not fear, not dread, but clarity. Something inside me whispered that I had crossed the threshold from anticipation into reality. The past months had been the slow rising of a tide. Now the water had reached the shore. Clara was back. The news didn't come from a phone call or a message. It came in the form of a silence that shifted the air in the house, a silence thick enough to recognize even when no one else could feel it. And somewhere beneath that silence, I sensed a trembling, not mine, but hers. Life had a way of reshaping people through loss. It had a way of forcing humility into those who refused to kneel willingly. It had a way of stripping illusions so thoroughly that the person left behind no longer resembled the one who began the journey. Clara was returning as the version of herself life had carved, not the one she had curated. I moved through my mornings slowly, allowing myself to feel the weight of what was approaching. There was no panic. Panic belonged to the past, to the woman I had been before. Daniel's envelope opened the truth he had left for me. Now there was only steadiness, a kind of internal preparation that didn't need words. Anthony sent me a brief update that afternoon. He informed me that he had delivered the legal notice to Clara, the one stating she had 30 days to vacate the apartment she believed belonged to her. He said she had received it in person. He said she was alone, confused, unprepared for the reality she could no longer escape. I wasn't surprised. Clara had lived so long, believing she was insulated from consequence, that she had forgotten how fragile, unearned security truly was. She had built her life on borrowed ground, and borrowed ground always collapses when truth arrives. I didn't know what she looked like now, whether she wore fatigue the way some people wear guilt, whether her eyes had dimmed from nights spent unraveling the lies Evan had wrapped her in, whether her voice trembled when she realized she had. No one left but the mother she betrayed. But I could imagine it. Life changes a person's posture when their illusions die. Hours passed in slow, deliberate rhythms. I made tea. I folded laundry. I reviewed documents. I allowed the house to settle into its familiar quiet. I didn't rehearse what I would say. There was nothing to rehearse. Whatever passed between us would not be constructed. It would be honest, raw, unshielded. Near evening, I felt a shift, the intangible kind that announces another person's presence long before they physically arrive. My heart tightened not from fear, but from recognition. The moment was coming. The knock on the door didn't startle me. It felt expected, almost rehearsed by life itself. I inhaled, let the air settle inside my chest, and walked toward the sound with steps that carried the fullness of every version of myself I had been: mother, widow, survivor, woman. When I opened the door, I saw the truth of Clara before I saw her face. She was not the daughter who had left with ambition burning behind her eyes. She was not the confident woman who believed the world owed her something. She was not the version of herself shaped by pretense and entitlement. She was someone life had dismantled, someone stripped of pretense, someone standing at the doorway of the only person who had ever loved her without condition. Her exhaustion filled the air around her like a confession she didn't know how to speak. Her shoulders carried a weight she had never known. Her hands trembled with the remnants of everything that had been taken from her, or everything she had surrendered willingly, thinking it would elevate her. But what struck me most was the look in her eyes, a look I hadn't seen since she was a child. A look carved by fear, humility, and the fragile hope that she wasn't too far gone to return home. I stepped aside, and she entered not as someone entitled to space, but as someone unsure she had the right to step inside. Her presence did not bring chaos. It brought truth raw and unfiltered, resting between us like an old wound finally exposed to air. Clara sat quietly, her hands clasped together, her breath shuddering every few moments, as if she were trying to keep herself from dissolving. I watched her without judgment, absorbing the transformation life had sculpted into her. She looked like someone who had been betrayed by the very dreams she chased. Someone who had trusted the wrong person with the wrong parts of her heart. Someone who had mistaken recklessness for courage and dependency for partnership. Someone who had descended into the consequences Daniel had predicted long before she ever boarded a flight. But beneath all of that, beneath the exhaustion, the shame, the quiet collapse, was something astonishing. Humility. Real humility. The kind forged in hardship. The kind people don't gain until the world has broken them just enough to let truth seep through. In that moment, I realized something that struck deeper than any betrayal. Clara had finally reached the point where understanding could begin. Not excuses, not justifications, not entitlement, understanding. But understanding doesn't erase damage. It only gives shape to what can come next. She took a breath that seemed to rattle through her entire body, and I felt the tension of 1,000 unspoken confessions gather in the room. I didn't interrupt them. I didn't soften them. I didn't save her from the discomfort of sitting with them. Because this was the moment she needed. Not to be rescued, but to be real. And as I looked at her, I saw fragments of the little girl she used to be, fragments buried beneath years of ambition and entitlement, fragments awakened by a fall so profound it stripped her down to something honest. There are moments in life when roles dissolve, when mother and daughter become something else, two human beings facing each other with nothing left to hide behind. This was one of those moments. I realized something else too. Her suffering did not bring me satisfaction. It brought me sorrow, but not regret. Because without this fall, she would never have confronted her reflection. Without this collapse, she would never have recognized the difference between love and convenience. Without this humiliation, she would never have understood the gravity of the choices she once made so casually. Life had not punished her. Life had corrected her. And I was not here to cushion the blow. I was here to witness her rebirth. Her breath trembled again, and her shoulders shook, not dramatically, but with the quiet grief of someone who finally understands the cost of their actions. This was the moment Daniel had prepared for. This was the moment his envelope had waited for. This was the moment when truth, consequence, love, and dignity collided in the same space. As I watched her sit there, unraveling silently, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, the birth of a new chapter. Not just for Clara, but for me. For the first time since Daniel died, I felt like I wasn't just living through something, I was shaping something. I wasn't reacting. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't shrinking. I was choosing. Choosing how to respond. Choosing how to rebuild. Choosing how to guide the path forward. Not through resentment, but through strength. Clara didn't look at me yet. She stared down at her trembling hands as if afraid that meeting my eyes would reveal too much. but she didn't need to look at me for me to understand. She had returned not because she had nowhere else to go. She had returned because she finally understood she had someone she shouldn't have left. And for the first time in a long time, I felt Daniel's presence settle into the room like a quiet affirmation. This moment, the brokenness, the vulnerability, the reckoning, was exactly what he had prepared us both for. Clara wasn't the only one who had transformed. I had too. And now both of us sat in the quiet space where transformation meets truth, waiting for the next breath, the next shift, the next inevitable turn. It would come. Life always brings the next moment when you're ready for it. And for the first time since everything began, I knew we both were. There are moments in life when silence becomes a language, when the space between two people carries more truth than words could ever hold. That was the silence Clara and I shared the day after she returned, fragile, trembling, but alive. It wasn't the silence of strangers. It wasn't the cold distance that once lived between us. It was the silence of a bridge being rebuilt plank by plank, slowly, painfully, but with intention. Clara woke early, long before she had the strength to face the weight of her new reality. I could sense it in the way she moved, hesitant, careful, almost apologetic, as if she were learning how to inhabit her own body again after months of being lost inside it. Everything about her had softened. The sharp edges she once wielded with pride were now rounded by exhaustion. The entitlement that once clouded her expression had dissolved, replaced by something humbler and infinitely more human. The collapse of a person isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives in the smallest gestures, the way someone lowers their gaze, the way their shoulders slope, the way they exhale like they're afraid. Breathing too deeply might break them further. Clara carried all of that, and something inside me recognized it, not with triumph, but with a quiet ache. She wasn't the woman who had left me behind. She wasn't the daughter who had carved her distance through arrogance. She was someone new, someone I had been waiting for without realizing it. But recognition doesn't erase consequence. Growth doesn't undo damage. Healing doesn't happen in a single moment of remorse. It happens in the uncomfortable days that follow, in the choices a person makes when no one is watching. Clara spent that morning trying to occupy herself with responsibilities she didn't know how to fulfill anymore. She tidied things that didn't need tidying. She reorganized drawers that hadn't been touched in years. She folded and refolded the same sweater with trembling hands, as if she could neatly arrange her unraveling life by forcing order onto meaningless tasks. But beneath her restlessness, I saw something essential. She wasn't avoiding me. She was avoiding herself. It is easier to clean a drawer than to confront the debris of your own decisions. It is easier to carry out chores than to carry the weight of your own reflection. It is easier to busy your hands than to face the parts of yourself you abandoned for love that never deserved the sacrifice. Clara was drifting in that space between remorse and realization, the space where a person understands what they've done, but hasn't yet found the courage to accept what comes next. I let her exist in that space. I didn't rush her toward confession. I didn't offer comfort she hadn't asked for. I didn't try to dissolve the discomfort she needed to feel. Growth requires friction, and this time she needed the friction more than she needed the softness. As the hours stretched forward, I noticed something shift in her, a slow unraveling of the defenses she had tried to put back on. She moved more quietly. She breathed more slowly. Her shoulders sank under the weight of truths she had not yet spoken. But grief, guilt, and humility eventually push a person to a breaking point, and by midday, Clara reached hers. She stood in the doorway of the living room with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to hold the pieces together long enough to form words. But no words came. Only tears, silent at first, then uncontrollable, raw, unrestrained. Tears not for what she had lost, but for what she had done. Tears not for Evan's betrayal, but for her own. There is a kind of cry that comes when a person finally sees themselves clearly. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is the cry of someone confronting the truth without escape, without excuses, without denial. Clara cried like that, as if grief and shame had been waiting for the exact moment when she felt safe enough to collapse fully. And in that collapse, something opened inside her. A space for honesty, a space for transformation, a space for the woman she could become if she had the courage to step into her own responsibility. She didn't speak. She didn't try to explain. She didn't try to rewrite the past. She simply allowed herself to be undone, and in that undoing, I saw the beginning of a new version of her, one shaped not by ambition or appearances, but by truth. The rest of that day passed in quiet reflection. Clara moved more slowly, as if each step required reconsideration. She paused, often absorbing the unfamiliar weight of humility, and although she didn't voice the thoughts swirling inside her, I could sense them. She was beginning to understand something she had been blind to for years. Love is not a license to take without giving. Love is not a guarantee of forgiveness. Love is not a shield from consequence. Love is a responsibility, a discipline, a way of being that requires presence, not performance. In the late afternoon, the quiet shifted again. Clara sat at the edge of her bed, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. Her silence wasn't avoidance this time, it was preparation. She was gathering the strength to do something she had never done before. She stood hesitated, then walked with hesitant steps toward my room. She paused in the doorway, breathing carefully, as though the act of standing there required more courage than anything she had done in her life. She didn't need to speak. I could feel the weight of what lived in her chest, the guilt, the remorse, the longing to repair what she had broken. Being a mother means understanding words that never leave the mouth. She took a deep breath, one that seemed to stretch through her entire past, and allowed herself to finally surrender not to me, but to her own truth. In that moment, I realized something profound. Clara wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for permission to change. And that is a different kind of redemption, one that does not erase the past but builds a different future. I didn't offer her absolution. I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't fill the silence with reassurances she hadn't yet earned. Instead, I let the air hold the truth between us. Because only when a person sits fully in their own accountability can healing begin. She spent the evening in reflection, moving through the house with a gentleness I had never seen before. She seemed to treat every object, every memory, every breath as something sacred, as if she had finally realized how much she had taken for granted. By night, something inside her had settled. Not peace, not yet. She understood now that her life had shattered not because she was unlucky, not because Evan betrayed her, not because the world was cruel, but because she had built her future on foundations that could not hold. And she was finally ready to build again. But this time, she would build differently, with humility instead of entitlement, with gratitude instead of expectation, with responsibility instead of assumption. As I sat alone later that night, I felt Daniel's presence again, quiet, steady, watchful. He had known this moment would come. He had trusted that I would know what to do when it did. And now, watching Clara step into the painful beginning of her own transformation, I felt something settle inside me. We were moving towards something important, not reconciliation, not forgiveness, not resolution, but truth. And truth is the only place real healing can begin. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new decisions, new reckonings. But for the first time in a long time, I believed we were finally moving in the right direction. Not backward into old wounds, not sideways into denial, forward, into honesty, into rebuilding, into the version of ourselves Daniel always believed we could become. In the days that followed Clara's quiet return, something began to shift between us, slowly, tentatively, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a return to what once was. It was something new, something fragile, something living in the delicate balance between love and consequence. Clara woke each morning with a determination I hadn't witnessed in years. It wasn't the ambition that once drove her to chase status or validation. It wasn't the desperation she carried when her world collapsed. This determination was different, rooted in humility, shaped by reflection, strengthened by loss. She moved with intention, choosing responsibility over impulse, choosing honesty over pride. She took a job cleaning offices at night not because she had to, but because she wanted to understand the dignity of standing on her own feet again. The woman who once dismissed small jobs now embraced them with a kind of reverence. She learned to wake tired but grateful. She learned to carry herself without entitlement. She learned to rebuild her confidence not through luxury, but through honest work that didn't need applause to matter. Every night when she returned home exhausted, her shoulders carried less shame and more resilience. I watched her with quiet pride not in what she accomplished, but in who she was finally becoming. Transformation is slow. It demands patience. It demands surrender. But most of all, it demands truth. And Clara was finally living in the truth she had once run from. Weeks passed. Paperwork shifted. Evidence surfaced. The legal process that Anthony orchestrated began taking shape. Clara had no idea that behind closed doors, her life was being protected by the woman she had once discarded. When the day came to reveal Daniel's legacy, I felt its weight in my chest, not as burden but as responsibility fulfilled. Anthony arranged the meeting in his office. Clara arrived dressed, simply carrying nothing but the fatigue of someone who had faced her own mistakes. She sat beside me, not as a child entitled to her mother's affection, but as a grown woman seeking clarity. And clarity is exactly what she received. Anthony laid the documents before her, page after page of evidence showing she had been a victim of fraud, not a perpetrator. Her debts dissolved in the language of the law. Her liabilities evaporated under the weight of proof. What she believed would haunt her future had been dismantled, piece by piece. She listened in stunned silence, her hands trembling, her breath growing shallow. Not from relief, not immediately, but from disbelief, because she could not understand how everything had been fixed without her knowledge. Then came the second folder. Daniel's portfolio, his properties, his investments, his quiet brilliance, his foresight, his love wrapped in legal precision. And then came the truth she had never imagined. All of it belonged to me. The foundation of the life she thought I had lost was rooted in abundance she never knew existed. The wealth she assumed was gone had never disappeared. The security she believed she had stolen from me had never been within her reach. She processed all of this slowly in silence, breathing as though each document revealed another version of the mother she never truly knew. By the time her eyes lifted to meet mine, something had shattered inside her, not the guilt, not the shame, but the illusion that she had ever been the one holding power over me. Her voice didn't need to form words. The truth lived in her expression. The mother she had underestimated was not weak. The mother she had exploited was not helpless. The mother she had condescended to was not the frail woman she had imagined collapsing in her absence. She saw me fully, clearly, for the first time in her life, and in that moment something profound occurred. She began seeing herself clearly too. Her tears were not dramatic. They were quiet, steady, and filled with a sorrow that reached into the deepest part of her being. Not sorrow for what she had lost, sorrow for who she had become. That was the moment the distance between us dissolved, not because forgiveness was granted, but because truth had finally taken its rightful place between us. From that day forward, Clara walked differently. She no longer carried guilt like a weight she couldn't bear. She carried responsibility willingly, deliberately, with the maturity that comes only from breaking and rebuilding. She chose to stay with me not as a child returning to the safety of home, but as a woman choosing to share life with the only family she had left. She contributed to the household not out of obligation, but out of respect. She worked, studied, and grew not for my approval but for her own redemption. She enrolled in a social work program driven not by ambition but by empathy born from lived experience. She sat with women who had lost everything. She listened to stories that mirrored her own. She offered compassion without judgment. She extended dignity the way she had once needed it most. Watching her rise from the ashes of her own mistakes felt like watching Daniel's love return to life through her actions. 6 months later, the foundation we built together opened its doors, a sanctuary for women escaping financial abandonment and emotional betrayal. Clara was part of every decision, every program. Every new beginning offered to someone who needed it. She didn't lead it with pride. She didn't champion it with ego. She nurtured it with humility. And in the quiet hours of the evening when she returned home from class or work, we sat together the way we had not done in years. Two women learning how to love without expectation, how to forgive without forgetting, how to rebuild without pretending the past never happened. It wasn't perfect, healing never is, but it was honest. And honesty, I learned, can build foundations stronger than money ever could. One evening, Clara handed me an acceptance letter for her master's program. She had earned it through her own effort, late nights studying after shifts, early mornings working weekends, volunteering at shelters. She told me she planned to pay for it herself, not because she distrusted my support, but because she wanted to honor the independence she had gained. The woman who once sold everything I loved for money now refused to let money define her path. That alone felt like the greatest transformation of all. Around the same time, she received a letter from Evan, from a French prison, filled with apologies and pleas she no longer had space for. She read it without anger or sadness, folded it once, and said only that the woman who married him no longer existed, and she was right. That version of her died somewhere between Europe and home. The woman living here now was someone else entirely, someone I was proud to know, not just as a daughter, but as a human being who had fought her way back to herself. Months later, on a quiet morning, Clara and I returned to the Florida beach house together. The house Daniel and I had cherished, the house she once sold as if memories held no value. She walked through it slowly, absorbing the weight of everything it represented: love, legacy, forgiveness, rebirth. Then, with a steady voice, she told me she wanted the house to become a refuge for women rebuilding their lives. Not just a shelter, but a place of renewal. A place where someone's darkest chapter could give birth to a new one. Daniel would have loved that decision. He believed a home had meaning only when it was shared. And so we did just that, turning the space that once held our family's joy into a sanctuary where others could rediscover their own. That evening, as Clara stood beside me, watching the first group of women arrive with their children, with their fear, with their hopes, I felt something settle deep inside my chest. Not closure, not victory, not triumph, peace. A peace built not from revenge, but from understanding. Not from punishment, but from transformation. Not from wealth, but from wisdom. Clara had lost everything she once valued, and in doing so, she found everything she truly needed. As for me, I found something too. I found the version of myself Daniel always believed in, the woman he prepared with foresight and love, the woman capable of standing tall through storms she never saw coming. I stood in that awareness, feeling his presence like a quiet blessing. We did it, Daniel. We did it together. Clara healed. I rose. And somewhere between betrayal and forgiveness, we built something stronger than anything we had before. A family not perfect, not untouched, not unchanged, but reborn.